Okay, so you're really trying to wrap your head around what's happening in education,
Yeah.
right? Like all the big changes, especially with the tech side of things.
Yeah.
This deep dive, we designed it for you.
Mm-hmm.
We want to help you cut through all that noise and really understand those fundamental shifts that are happening and look at all the powerful tools that are kind of coming into play without making you feel overwhelmed.
Right. We don't want to overwhelm you. We want to look at some really interesting changes,
Yeah.
really significant changes that are happening in education. And what we're going to focus on is this idea of technologies, things like digital twins and artificial intelligence, AI. These technologies they're really the drivers of this evolution, but they're also being impacted by it in return, kind of a two-way street.
Yeah, like how are they shaping education? How is education shaping them?
Exactly.
So to unpack all this, to really look at it, we've got some incredible insights from a discussion that happened recently featuring some really big names. Michael Kelly, he was a dean at Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Ottawa.
Wow.
Eilif Trondsen, been in Silicon Valley for 40 years.
40 years. That's amazing.
Catherine Teterinoff,
Yeah.
assistant professor at HEC Lausanne. And Pavan Konanur, he's the CEO and co-founder of Hoja AI.
So we've got quite a breadth of expertise there.
And we looked at the full recording of their conversation.
Okay.
We wanted to make sure we captured all the nuance and the details of their thoughts.
Yeah.
The aim here is to extract the key insights. What's changing? What's the impact of all this new technology? And then what might the future hold?
Yeah, good question.
But in a way that gives you a balanced perspective, a balanced view of what's going on, and highlights some of the things that, frankly, we found really surprising as we dove into this.
Yeah, some unexpected things always come up in these conversations, don't they?
Always. So let's jump right in. Let's start unpacking this. Let's talk about what are the core changes that we're seeing right now in education. You know, one thing that struck me is, or our experts pointed out, that higher education actually has a really strong track record, a strong foundation.
Right.
Think about all those major breakthroughs in AI, in quantum computing, biotech, material science. A lot of that really originated from universities.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you think about it, they are the bedrock of research. That's undeniable. But our sources also acknowledge it's not like there isn't room for improvement.
Yeah.
They need to grow. They need to adapt. One of the things that came up a few times is access. Access to education for more students and doing it in a way that's more cost effective, right? Making it more affordable.
Yeah.
You know, there's more demand for education, but the costs are going up.
Right.
So how do we do that?
And you see institutions like Arizona State University, the University of New Hampshire, Southern New Hampshire University, they're really embracing tech as a way to break down those barriers.
Yeah, using technology.
To make it more accessible and more affordable.
Yeah.
You know, that's a pretty big shift in thinking, I think.
Is it
Away from that kind of traditional brick and mortar, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of technology, something else that came up is this idea of AI, artificial intelligence, and the fact that universities seem to be more and more accepting of it. You know, there was some initial fear, some skepticism.
Like, oh no, the robots are coming for us.
Yeah, exactly. But now there seems to be a recognition that, well, it can actually help us.
Yeah.
It can add value. It can help us change the way we teach, improve pedagogy, and create new avenues for learning, right? New ways to engage with material.
Yeah. And one of the most interesting ideas that came up, and this is for you, thinking big picture here, is that AI has the potential to really transform education in less developed countries.
Oh, yeah.
You think about regions where school infrastructure is limited or it's underdeveloped. This could be a game changer.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
AI could really help to raise those overall education levels.
Wow. That's a really insightful point.
And maybe even leapfrog some of those traditional infrastructure limitations.
Yeah. Like you don't need to build a school in every village.
Right.
You can deliver personalized learning to really remote areas without having that physical presence. That's a radical departure from how we've always done things.
It is. But it's not without its hurdles. There are challenges with acceptance.
Yeah. It's not always easy to implement new technologies, especially in education. There are always barriers.
Our experts mentioned this Norwegian academic journal.
Oh, interesting.
Published a series of articles specifically to demystify AI for faculty.
So they were trying to make the teachers more comfortable with the technology.
Yeah, to try to ease some of those concerns.
It makes sense. If you don't understand something, you're more likely to be afraid of it.
Yeah. And then you have concerns closer to home, like the California State University system. They've got this AI initiative.
I've heard about that. It's pretty ambitious, isn't it?
It is. But the teachers union there, they've expressed reservations.
Oh, really? What are they worried about?
They're worried about their jobs, about how it's going to change their roles.
Yeah, that's understandable.
And it kind of highlights that for this to really work, it can't just be about teachers.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to involve students, administrators, even those companies that will be hiring the graduates.
Yeah, it needs to be a collaboration. Everyone needs to be on board.
It does. But I will say, one thing that was encouraging is that compared to maybe a few years ago, there seems to be a much more open attitude.
Yeah. More than before.
More open to adopting AI and other technology.
That's a big shift.
It is.
It's not just pessimism anymore. People are realizing this is something they need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone understands it.
Right, of course not. Just because you're open to it doesn't mean you know how to use it.
Yeah. And that seems to be one of the big challenges.
What is that?
That educators are faced with this huge array of different AI tools. But there's a lot of confusion about how to actually use them effectively in teaching, in grading, in curriculum development.
Oh, I see. So it's like having all the ingredients but not knowing how to cook.
Exactly. You don't know what recipe to use, what to put together.
So you've got all these fancy tools, but you might not be getting the most out of them.
Right. And it seems that students are actually adopting a lot of these AI tools at a much faster rate than their instructors.
Oh, interesting. So there's a disconnect there.
Yeah.
A gap between how students are learning and how teachers are teaching.
And how they're being evaluated. How do you assess someone's understanding?
Right. If students are using AI to learn, but teachers aren't using AI to teach, how do you make sure they're actually learning what they need to know?
Exactly.
That's a really tricky problem to solve.
And it's interesting, when you look at where academics are using AI right now, it seems to be more on the research side of things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Norwegian journal, they were talking about AI in research methodologies, but not so much in the actual teaching.
So the application in the classroom is lagging behind.
Yeah. And, you know, they brought up case studies, like the classic case study method of teaching.
Yeah, the Harvard Business School model, right?
Exactly. But they were saying that even that's becoming less effective because students can easily find the solutions online.
Oh, I see. So they're not really challenged to think critically about the problem.
Right. It doesn't force them to grapple with it the way it used to.
So that's a fundamental challenge, isn't it? How do we make sure students are still developing those critical thinking skills?
Yeah, and they talked about, there was a Harvard seminar. They're actually exploring using AI to write the case studies.
Wow.
So that it's constantly generating new and relevant scenarios.
That's fascinating. So the AI is actually helping to keep the curriculum up to date.
Yeah, and then the big question is, if AI can produce really high quality written work, like a master's thesis, for example,
Right.
how do you assess what a student really knows?
Yeah. How do you know they actually wrote it and understood the material?
Right, so it's forcing a reevaluation of those assessment methods, maybe moving back towards more critical thinking, analytical ability. It's almost like we need to go back to basics in some ways.
Oh, in a way, yeah.
Focus on the core skills that AI can't replicate.
Exactly. All right, so let's get into the tools themselves. We've talked about AI, but there are others as well. AI, digital twins, XR. That includes augmented and virtual reality.
Right.
The experts seem to agree that AI is the most powerful tool at the moment.
Yeah, it's pretty versatile, isn't it?
It is.
It can be applied to so many different things.
But let's talk about digital twins. What are those and how are they being used in education?
So at their core, digital twins are virtual replicas. Like, they can be replicas of physical objects or biological systems or even, in theory, human brains.
Oh, that's a bit mind-blowing.
Yeah. But in education, I think a more immediate application is using them to create virtual environments.
For training and teaching, kind of like a flight simulator, but for anything.
Like a simulation of a city or a forest.
Yeah. Imagine a simple digital twin. It's like, you go online, you look at a weather simulation.
Oh, okay.
It's showing you the current conditions. But a more complex industrial one, that's like a full hurricane model, constantly updating with real-time data to predict the path and intensity of the storm.
Wow.
It's a very powerful tool.
And they gave this great example of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Oh, yeah. What are they doing?
They're using virtual environments to train their employees.
In what kind of scenarios?
Oh, all kinds of things, like how to respond to a natural disaster, how to negotiate with armed groups.
That's intense.
It is.
Yeah.
And the great thing is, this is really accessible. People can participate in these training simulations online from anywhere.
So it really democratizes access to that kind of training, doesn't it?
It does.
You don't have to travel to a specific location. You can
No.
do it from your own home.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that there are different types of digital twins.
Okay, so like different levels of complexity.
Yeah, you have the really sophisticated ones, the industrial applications.
Hmm.
They're using real-time data feeds, constantly updating that virtual model.
Okay.
But then you have others that are more like online gaming environments.
Okay. So more familiar to a lot of people.
Exactly.
I mean, millions of people play games like Fortnite and Minecraft, right?
Exactly. So they're already used to navigating those kinds of virtual spaces.
Yeah, so the transition to using them for learning might be a lot smoother.
Exactly. So imagine, let's say you're in a university supply chain management program.
Okay.
You could use digital twins to create a virtual representation of an entire supply chain
Oh, interesting.
and then let the students run simulations.
So they can experiment with different scenarios.
Yeah. See what happens if there's a tariff, for example, or a natural disaster.
And they can do it in a safe environment where there are no real-world consequences.
Exactly. It's hands-on learning, but without the risk.
It's like a virtual sandbox for them to play in.
Yeah, and it gives them a kind of virtual work experience, right?
Yeah, and it allows them to develop skills that are really hard to get through traditional apprenticeships.
Like negotiation skills.
Yeah, or understanding how global logistics chains work.
It's something that's really hard to replicate in a traditional classroom setting.
And it's not just small-scale applications either.
Right.
NVIDIA, the tech company, they're heavily involved in that California State University project.
Yeah.
And they've got big ambitions to lead in what they call the industrial metaverse.
That sounds futuristic.
It is. It's basically like a highly realistic, interconnected virtual environment, going beyond simple simulations to create truly immersive learning experiences.
At a massive scale.
Yeah, potentially connecting universities and industries in ways that we haven't even thought of yet.
So you could have students from all over the world collaborating in the same virtual space.
Exactly. And it could potentially drive down the cost of these simulations, making them accessible to more institutions.
So this is something that could really benefit everyone.
It could, if it's done right.
And it's not just NVIDIA. You've got Google, Microsoft, all the big tech companies are getting involved in education in a much bigger way.
Yeah, they're not just providing software tools anymore. They're actually developing AI solutions specifically for education.
Like for lesson planning, for example.
Yeah, or content creation, or even integrating these AI tools into existing university software licenses.
Like Microsoft Copilot.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of potential for these kinds of partnerships, right? Where companies bring their resources and expertise.
Yeah, but there are also concerns about maintaining the integrity of academic institutions.
Yeah, making sure that universities don't just become workforce training centers.
Right. It's about finding that balance, that equilibrium between the needs of industry and the goals of education.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that we really need to be paying attention to as this all unfolds. So let's look ahead a little bit. What does the future hold for education in this kind of rapidly changing technological landscape?
Yeah. Well, one of the big challenges is, at the individual level, will academics actually adopt these new tools?
Yeah, it comes down to the human element, right?
It does. You can have the most amazing technology in the world, but if people aren't willing to use it, it's not going to make a difference.
And then there's the institutional challenge. How do you create that shared understanding across the entire ecosystem? Academics, private sector, nonprofits, they all have different motivations.
It's true. Universities operate on a very different timeline than a tech startup.
Exactly. And there still seems to be a bit of fear, a bit of caution around industry involvement in education.
I think that's particularly true in places where there hasn't been as much historical interaction between universities and the private sector.
Like Norway, for example.
Exactly. But, they also highlighted some really successful examples of collaboration.
Yeah, like companies generating learning content for their employees and partnering with platforms like Coursera.
And the University of Texas, they're giving thousands of students free access to Coursera micro-credentials.
I think that's a really smart move.
Yeah, it recognizes the value of these shorter, more focused courses.
And it makes them more accessible to people who maybe wouldn't have the time or resources for a traditional degree.
Exactly. But, it also brings us back to that question of critical thinking.
Right.
If AI can generate all this content, how do we make sure that students are still developing the ability to think for themselves?
Yeah, it's almost like we need a whole new way of teaching, a whole new way of assessing what people know and can do.
Maybe. Or maybe we need to go back to some of the older methods, like oral exams, where you can't just rely on AI to give you the answers.
That's an interesting idea.
And we need to educate people, not just students, but educators as well, on how to use these tools responsibly, ethically.
Yeah, it's not just about being able to generate text. It's about understanding the implications of what you're creating, how it can be used, and how it might be misused.
Absolutely. And I think that's where things like open labs can really play a role.
Like the ones at Stanford and ASU.
Yeah, those are great examples. They provide a safe space for people to experiment, to learn, to fail.
And to get comfortable with these new technologies without feeling like you're being judged.
Exactly. And I think one of the most exciting possibilities is the potential for truly personalized learning experiences
Yeah, tailoring the content and the pace to each individual student,
and addressing their specific needs and challenges.
moving away from this one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, because we all learn differently, right?
Right. And AI has the potential to really tap into that.
To create a learning experience that is truly unique to each individual.
And it makes you question the whole concept of grades, doesn't it?
It does. Are grades still relevant in a world where learning is so individualized?
They were initially introduced as a way to make assessment more efficient, more standardized.
But maybe we don't need that level of standardization anymore.
Maybe we need to move towards more personalized assessments like those oral exams you mentioned.
Yeah, or even portfolio-based assessments where students can showcase their work and demonstrate their understanding in a more holistic way.
And there's this fascinating insight from a professor at ASU, and they actually published a report on this you can find online as a flip book.
Oh, cool. I'll have to check that out.
They said that the real power of generative AI in learning actually comes from the individual.
From the student.
Yeah, it empowers them to take ownership of their learning,
Yeah.
to become more self-directed.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. It's not about the institution dictating what you learn and how you learn it.
It's about giving students the tools and the agency to create their own learning journey.
And institutions are starting to recognize this. HEC Lausanne, they're taking a very inclusive approach to developing their AI policies involving students, faculty, administrators, everyone,
That's really smart. It recognizes that everyone has a stake in this.
and that the expertise is constantly evolving.
We're all learning as we go.
Exactly. So looking ahead, I think it's clear that we're in for a pretty wild ride.
Yeah, the landscape of education is changing faster than ever before.
But the experts we spoke to, they were all very optimistic about the potential.
They believe that these new technologies have the power to make learning more effective, more engaging, more accessible.
And ultimately, more equitable.
Yeah, so everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
So as you think about your own learning journey, how do you see these technologies shaping your future?
It's a really interesting question to consider. And for those of you who are interested in exploring some of these bigger picture ideas around AI and its impact on society, I'd recommend checking out Ezra Klein's podcast episode on AGI, Artificial General Intelligence.
Yeah, that was a really thought-provoking episode.
It's not specifically about education, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the change that's coming.
And the potential for AI to transform, not just how we learn, but how we live.
Exactly. We're on the cusp of something truly revolutionary, and it's exciting to be a part of it.
Absolutely. And as we navigate this new landscape, it's important to remember that we have the power to shape it,
We can choose how we use these technologies, and we can ensure that they are used for good.
to create a future where everyone has the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to thrive.
That's a future worth striving for.
Absolutely.